We'll just give a minute for everybody to get into the webinar, then we'll start. Okay. Well, welcome everybody to our next provider webinar series hosted by MDisability. So MDisability is a department program here at University of Michigan under the Department of Family Medicine. And it's a program to really just help improve the inclusion and the primary care for people with various types of disabilities. And I'm delighted to have our next speaker, Erik Robeznieks. And he's going to be talking about adaptive sports program. Before I introduce him, I do want to just thank a few of our sponsors. So the University of Michigan Center for Disability Health and Wellness, and also the Fisher Fund have allowed us to be able to host these webinar series and to provide CART. So for those of you who need CART services, we do have a CART, a captionist available, and you can go to the bottom of your screen to turn that on. And additionally, for the questions and answer, we're going to hold those until the end. But during the presentation or the webinar, feel free to type out any questions that you may have for our presenter, and we will address them in the order that we receive them. So I am delighted to go ahead. One other thing I forgot. My name is Mike McKee. I'm an associate professor here at the Department of Family Medicine and direct MDisability. So anyway, so I would like to introduce our presenter. And so Erik has actually done a lot around the adaptive sports, so we're really delighted to have him here. Following a career in able-bodied sport, he earned his Bachelor of Science degree in kinesiology and health science from York University. Then after being introduced to the world of parasports, Erik worked at Wheelchair Basketball Canada. He managed the operations for the national programs and was also with Team Canada at the Rio 2016 Paralympics and several other major international competitions. With an ignited passion for leading and developing sports programs, he then earned his master's in business administration at Toronto Metropolitan University that culminated in his thesis, examining the potential inclusion of adaptive sports in NCAA. The thesis addresses issues of law, equity, social, cultural perceptions of disability in adaptive sports, and program development. In 2020, Erik joined the leadership of Dr. Okalami and the Adaptive Sports and Fitness program at the University of Michigan. As an assistant director of University of Michigan Adaptive Sports and Fitness, also known as ASF, he has implemented recommendations from his study in real life. Under Erik's leadership, the adaptive sports and fitness has actually supported a variety of recreational and competitive wheelchair tennis, wheelchair basketball, para-track and field, and wheelchair rugby. And they lead the nation in embedding parasports in K-12 programming through adaptive sports and inclusion recreation initiative. And they are intimately involved with NCAA parasport inclusion through the adaptive sports student-athlete program. Erik's passion for parasport and inclusive sport opportunities extend beyond his professional capacity, as he also competes in wheelchair basketball, a 2019 Canada Games silver medalist with Team Ontario. And he volunteers for the board of directors for Para-Equestrian Nonprofit Therapeutic Riding Incorporation in Ann Arbor. So I am delighted to have Erik join us. So I'm going to turn it over. And he will be presenting on examining the landscape of opportunities of collegiate adaptive sports programs. And thank you, Erik.
Thank you, Dr. McKee, and thank you, Dawn, and everybody else from MDisability for having me today for this presentation. As introduced, my name is Erik Robeznieks. I go by he, him, his. I'm the Assistant Director of Adaptive Sports and Fitness here at the University of Michigan. I'm coming to you live today from Orlando as our team is competing at the Collegiate Wheelchair Tennis National Championships. I'm sitting in a hotel room with a white background behind me, a maize polo with a block M, and a white baseball cap with the Wolverine logo on top. Excited to talk to you all today about the landscape and history and future of collegiate adaptive sport, as I believe this is an incredibly important topic as we talk about the health and wellness of people with disabilities, but also the broader personal, interpersonal, and societal impacts that this topic has within the educational setting, within our day-to-day life, and understanding how we each play a role in facilitating access when it comes to health and wellness, whether it's by means of competitive sport, recreational sport, or other leisure programs that we can provide. Sorry here, just navigating technical difficulties. So growing up, being an athlete, playing sports was a major component in my life. It was all consuming in terms of my identity. And I believe that sport is one of the greatest microcosms of life, particularly for youth. It's an opportunity to experience and learn from social situations that are transferable to so many other aspects in life, for personal, interpersonal, academic, and professional scenarios. Being an athlete was my main focus in life until a severe knee injury that caused me to leave sport, specifically playing ice hockey at that time. I experienced a number of surgeries and reconstructive interventions that ultimately led me down a path of academia as opposed to athletics, or so I thought. One of the most prominent things that I recall from my time were all of the interactions that I had with my sport medicine physicians, physical therapists, occupational therapists, surgeons, friends, family, that all told me about various narratives and stories of athletes that had to deal with hardship and overcome significant obstacles in their journeys as athletes, overcoming severe knee injuries only to return to the top of the podium. Now, on the one hand, that should feel motivating, especially for an athlete like myself that identified as someone that would work harder than anybody else to achieve the end goal. But it wasn't. The numerous appointments that I had with my surgeons and sport medicine physicians and physical therapists all felt me leaving like I was on a journey to conquer and summit Mount Everest. And that coming up short of anything but the summit was going to be a failure. While I'm able to do many able-bodied activities today, the physical activity that I perform today and the sports and recreation that I engage in look very different from what I was able to do back in my teenage years. And in hindsight, I think that the comprehensive paradigm over the course of that process of injury, of surgery, of recovery could have been framed and shifted very differently, as opposed to putting things in a perspective where I had to get back to what was considered quote unquote normal. We should have redefined what that progress and process could have looked like and figured out ways that could have been more adaptive to what my needs and wants were as someone that identified as being physically active and participated in those activities as a core part of my life. Concurrent with my medical experiences, I began to reevaluate my path in life, understanding what athletics really means to me and what my involvement was going to look like. And ultimately, that led me down a path of pursuing academia further through my undergraduate and graduate career. Ultimately, through my undergraduate experiences with a background in kinesiology and health science, it directed me towards a path of discovering wheelchair basketball and discovering the world of parasport. It was in a classroom setting where I had a guest lecturer talk about parasport in the parasport community and talk about the Paralympics. And I recall this being the first instance where I was exposed to such a topic. And up until then, being an able-bodied athlete, it was a world that I never really considered. But after all the experiences that I had up until that point, my paradigm started to shift in terms of what sport could be and what sport looks like, and what normal looks like when it comes to sport participation. It made a lot of sense logically sitting in that guest lecture and understanding that there are ways to modify rules and equipment that allow for equitable participation. And that interest led me down a road to further pursue conversations with people in the parasport community in Wheelchair Basketball Canada, which ultimately led me to a 4-year position working with the national programs at the junior and senior level, supporting everything from long-term athlete development to event management, doing performance analytics, and various other roles with the national teams, culminating in some wonderful experiences where I got to interact with people and learn from people all across the globe. And that really cemented my belief that there is still some sanctity, there is still some purity in sport as a universal language, as a platform that can bring people together across cultures, across identities. But at the same time, through all of my experiences with Wheelchair Basketball Canada, I also began to recognize how this universal language of sport isn't always accessible to everyone. Some voices are heard, some are not heard, some communicate differently than others, and some listen differently than others. And in this global conversation of sport, there are some very important voices that were being left out of the room, left out of the discussion. And that ignited my passion to really dive further into the world of adaptive sport to understand what we could do to better support access and opportunity so that everybody had that voice. Everybody had the ability to converse in this unifying language of sport, to bring people together, to bring communities together. That is what ultimately led me to my graduate work. But through all of those experiences at Wheelchair Basketball Canada, I had a full circle moment where I learned that I could play wheelchair basketball as well. Typically, for parasport, an athlete needs to meet eligibility criteria on the basis of permanent disability. Classification is a very nuanced and contentious topic, and it's also consistently a contentious topic amongst athletes, coaches, governing sport bodies, and medical practitioners. As simply put as possible, my current function as a result of injuries and surgeries leave me eligible for some leagues, but not all. And this is a moving needle and something that's worth a lecture in and of itself. But what I love about wheelchair basketball, and particularly within the Canadian ethos and the Canadian domestic system, is that fully able-bodied people are endorsed and supported in their participation in adaptive sport, a paradigm that's very different than other places internationally. Legendary wheelchair basketball athlete himself, Patrick Anderson, says, "If you can sit, you can play." And this is a motto that we use in our program at University of Michigan, Adaptive Sports and Fitness, recognizing that at the fundamental level, when we create opportunity for equitable participation, adaptive sport shouldn't just be for people with disabilities, but rather a mechanism through which we can create inclusive opportunities for all people to play. To summarize, through able-bodied inclusion, you can use parasport as a medium that creates a natural opportunity, a natural forum for socialization, community, and inclusion. And I think that was one of the overall biggest lessons that I took away from my time at Wheelchair Basketball Canada, the power to bring sport together. But as I mentioned, that there is a little bit of a gap. There are some people that have more access than others. And in some instances, purely on the basis of disability, a lot of people don't get introduced to adaptive sport through the traditional mechanisms that we are all familiar with, whether that's K to 12 physical education, whether that's after school programming, competitive leagues, what have you. As an able-bodied individual growing up, I almost had to actively turn away from sport and direct my attention away from it. You're constantly being recruited and pushed towards physical activity opportunities. Whereas growing up with a physical disability, in many of the conversations and friendships that I've made over my time now working in parasport, that is certainly not the case for a lot of people, where they have to seek out programs in far neighborhoods far, far away from them, and seek out funding resources and seek out all kinds of other additional opportunities and surpass great barriers just to be able to access recreational programming, let alone competitive programming, or let alone something that is offered with great consistency throughout the year. So I knew that through my pursuit of a master's in business, that I would have the opportunity to merge that or blend that with my kinesiology background, with my experiences at Wheelchair Basketball Canada, to understand what the path forward would be for expanding opportunity within adaptive sport. And that led me to the idea of my thesis around examining the inclusion of adaptive sport in the NCAA, recognizing that there were a lot of youth-aged, college-aged athletes that were going to the US to play adaptive sports at the collegiate level, like wheelchair basketball or wheelchair tennis at various universities, but were not being afforded the same resources and support that their able-bodied counterparts were being given. So I explored this topic from a social lens, from a legal lens, from a policy lens, to understand what are the barriers and what are the opportunities, really doing a large scale SWOT analysis of collegiate adaptive sport. And through this opportunities, or through this research, I had many opportunities to connect with people across the country, ranging from the grassroots sphere through collegiate, coaches, administrators, to talk about the current state of adaptive sport within the United States and understanding what could be done to move forward. The end result was a qualitative study examining the potential inclusion of adaptive sport in the NCAA. And one of the interviewees from that study was Dr. Okunlami from University of Michigan, who at the time was trying to grow an adaptive sport and start an adaptive sport program at the University of Michigan. At the time, Dr. Okunlami was in the very early years of trying to get the support he needed to start a program at the University of Michigan. He had a great vision of what an adaptive sport program could look like at an institution like the University of Michigan, an institution that values education, innovation, leadership, athletics. The network that Dr. Okunlami illustrated of bringing together in the disciplines and fields of study at Michigan Medicine and at the University of Michigan painted a holistic landscape that would create not only opportunity for people with disabilities in the University of Michigan and Ann Arbor community, but serve as a flagship for how this should be done across the country. Among all the people that I interviewed in my research study and all the work thereafter, Dr. Okunlami had a vision that could not be compared to anybody else in terms of the holistic nature of how to bring these resources and people and disciplines together. And it was not too long after, and many spirited discussions later, I joined Dr. Okunlami in 2020 to set out on our journey of growing an adaptive sport and fitness program at the University of Michigan. But before I get further into the entire landscape of adaptive sports, I think it's important to do some level setting in terms of what I mean when I talk about adaptive sports. The definition that we go by here at the University of Michigan is that adaptive sports, also known as parasports, are competitive and recreational sports for people with and without disabilities. Adaptive sports use the modification of rules or equipment so that all people can equitably participate in sport. There are adaptive sports that are variations of existing able-bodied adaptive sports, more or less parallel to those existing sport activities, like wheelchair basketball and basketball, wheelchair tennis and tennis. And some adaptive sports have been specifically designed for a person with a disability and do not have an equivalent activity, like goalball, which is for the blind or visually impaired community. Now, the word parasport comes from the word or the Greek preposition para, meaning alongside, and the word Olympic. Now, many people have the misconception that Paralympic means paraplegic Olympics or some other derivative of that. But in fact, it is quite a beautiful word when you look at it and you look at the deeper meaning of what it is trying to evoke. When we talk about parallel Olympics or Paralympics, it is a notion that through the proper resources and support and social recognition, people with disabilities can live a mirrored life to the able-bodied community and society and structure that we know. It's just that the world and the politics and the policies around us have not been constructed in such a way. And that's not necessarily wrong. We can't look at the past and point fingers and blame, but what we can do is understand how to move forward by creating equitable modifications. When we look at sport, the use of a sport chair for basketball or for tennis can serve as a level playing field so that everybody can participate. Kids, siblings, parents, friends, teachers. And when we look at adaptive sport in such a way, we understand how this is applicable in all aspects of life. What we're really talking about is universal design, whether it's academic accommodations or workplace accommodations or ramps in front of buildings. Adaptive sport truly can be a center point around how we can create society as a whole more inclusive and more equitable. When we look at building collegiate adaptive sport programs, then it could really be a linchpin for driving some major societal changes. But first, we have to look at some of the barriers that impact collegiate adaptive sport programs. And I'll sum those up in three major categories. The first being equity. When we look at the proportionality of collegiate programs or sport programs to the population within the United States ranging 5 to 17, when you look at people with no disability, there are about 45,000 people for every college program that offers NCAA or rec sports within the United States. When you look at people with a disability, it's 138,000 per every program. Now, the reason why I bring that statistic up is that it becomes increasingly more competitive and there's increasingly greater demand for these programs than there are actual programming opportunities across the United States. And what this means is that there's limited opportunities for participation, limited scholarship opportunities for people to then engage in adaptive sports at the collegiate level. And it also results in geographic disparity across the country. Predominantly, a lot of these programs are centralized around the Southwest, Southeast, number in the Midwest. But by and large, if you are a high school, you identify as having a disability, you're in high school and looking to continue your participation in sport at the collegiate level, it likely means that you're going to have to move across the country somewhere and pay out-of-state tuition to be able to attend a college that offers inclusive and adaptive recreational or competitive programming. And that creates a significant dropout rate in sport. When we look at the overall pipeline of sport participation across the lifespan, as an able-bodied individual, there are many opportunities to join sport, join fitness clubs, join all sorts of different opportunities depending on where you are in your stage of life and your level of involvement. But for adaptive sport, depending on where you live, depending on how old you are, you could be boxed out of those different recreational or competitive opportunities just by nature of the fact that you have a disability and you're in the wrong place at the wrong time. Overall, when we look at the benefits of sport, it's undoubtedly known all the benefits and the transferable benefits that come from sport participation. An important study, and I'd like to compare in this time the experiences of disabled individuals and women in sport, because I think there are a lot of similarities that we can learn from so as to not replicate some previous mistakes that have happened within the collegiate sport atmosphere. When we look at female athletes, there was a great study done by Ernst Young and ESPNW in studying why female athletes make winning entrepreneurs. And there's some statistics shown on the screen there, where 52% of C-suite executives played collegiate sport at one point in their lives, 94% played sport at one point in their lives, and 74% attribute sport to their success as executives in business, stating that sport can accelerate a woman's career. And you look at the intangibles of leadership, teamwork, work ethic, and accountability. And lastly, I'll talk about the employment statistics. In 2022, the employment population ratio for persons aged 16 to 64 without a disability was 74.4%. With a disability was 34.8%. That statistic right there is absolutely alarming to me and alarming to a lot of other people that work within the industry of serving people with disabilities. And I believe that collegiate adaptive sport programs can be the answer to supporting people in terms of getting their education and all the other transferable benefits that come from sport participation: leadership, dedication, work ethic, time management. The list goes on. A fundamental experience, all this to say, that is gained through post-secondary education is a proficiency in work, life, and citizenship. Now, before I talk about the present state and the future of adaptive sport, I'll do a brief overview of the collegiate adaptive sport history and some of the landmarks that have happened that lead us to where we are today. Following World War II, there was a federal bill that mandated veterans with disabilities could receive education and rehabilitation training. There were many misconceptions about people with disabilities at that time and what they were able to do. Most people believed that those with disabilities could not live independently. And in comes Dr. Timothy Nugent, who's displayed left on the screen here, sitting in a chair in a beige suit and a tie. Dr. Timothy Nugent was hired as director of the first university program in the country at the University of Illinois to provide services for students with disabilities. This ultimately resulted in his creation of the first collegiate wheelchair basketball program at the University of Illinois, the Illinois Giz Kids, with the class of 4950 displayed on the right-hand side, with several wheelchair basketball members of that team. Dr. Nugent's focus was to rehabilitate the whole person, not just their injuries. In addition to the sports program, Dr. Nugent and his students were activists on campus for accessibility, whether it was physical accessibility, like building ramps, or academic accommodations as well. A lot of Dr. Nugent's work would go on to inform the Americans with Disabilities Act. And in 1949, Dr. Nugent formed the NWBA, the National Wheelchair Basketball Association, which is still the governing body of wheelchair basketball today in the United States. And in 1956, University of Illinois continued on its path of leadership within the space of providing sport at the collegiate level for people with disabilities by creating the first collegiate wheelchair track program at the University of Illinois. In 1969, Southwest Minnesota State University formed their wheelchair basketball program and is still active today. On screen is displayed the SMSU logo. In 1973, brought about social justice and disability rights by way of the Rehab Act that would significantly impact the landscape of adaptive sport. Before the Rehab Act, the fight for civil rights didn't include people with disabilities. Disabled people faced rampant discrimination and segregation in American life. Disabled people experienced high rates of unemployment and were taught in separate schools. In 1973, the Rehab Act was passed, a federal law in the United States that prohibited discrimination on the basis of disability. But 4 years after it took effect, it really still had no implementing regulations, making it essentially useless in everyday life. In comes a mother of disability rights in the United States, the late Judy Heumann. Judy and other disability rights activists turned to grassroots mobilization and protesting to organize efforts to enact change in actual implementation of the Rehab Act across daily life. Section 504 of the Rehab Act states that no otherwise qualified individual with a disability shall be excluded from the participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subject to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. Now, the operative words in this preceding statement is otherwise qualified. This term has been highly contentious in litigation cases regarding the Rehab Act because the most often cited working definition is otherwise qualified. It's that accommodations can be made within reason. Now, regarding athletics, to make a case founded on Section 504, an athlete must establish that they are disabled, that they are otherwise qualified, that they were excluded from participation on the basis of disability, and that the defendant receives federal funding. In summary, the Rehab Act laid important groundwork for the ADA in 1990 and has implications to this day about opportunities for students with disabilities to participate in sport. Namely, what does otherwise qualified truly mean? And where are institutions or organizations allowed to draw the line when it comes to being otherwise qualified? And second, what constitutes a major life activity? And I'll explore both of those more as we continue through this presentation. Now, in 1976, we saw the creation of the University of Texas Arlington Collegiate Adaptive Sport Program. They were known as the Freewheelers and were led by Jim Hayes, who also founded and began serving as the inaugural director of University of Texas Arlington's Office for Students with Disabilities. He formed a wheelchair basketball team to quote unquote, get disabled students out of their rut. And the pictures shown below are several old photos of the Freewheelers wheelchair basketball team at UTA, a team photo, an individual action shot, and another team photo on the UTA campus. The first Freewheelers team had 6 players, including both UTA students and staff, with Jim Hayes acting as a player coach. The Movin' Mavs repeated as champions of the league in 92, 93, 94, and were one of the first collegiate teams in the program, collegiate wheelchair teams in the program, to be invited to the White House following their championship win in 1993. It is worth noting several points about the UTA Movin' Mavs, now known as the Movin' Mavs program, and its origins. First is that many collegiate adaptive sport programs are started through the mechanism of drawing upon staff and community members. The University of Michigan is no different, as it is currently a catch-22 situation when growing programs like this. To build a program, you need students, but student athletes won't be drawn to your program unless you have a team that they can join. In present day, it is common for newer collegiate adaptive sport programs to have community-facing aspects to what they do as a means to draw in participants and to build a participating base. Second, similar to Dr. Timothy Nugent, Jim Hayes was the Director of Services for Students with Disabilities at UTA. This is often the origin point for collegiate adaptive sport programs and is often where they reside in the long term, existing as segregated entities from rec sport, club sport, or athletic departments. Third, the impetus of the programs getting disabled students out of their rut, quote unquote, still marks tones of medical model of disability, pinning the state, physical, mental, social, on the individual, and not necessarily looking outward to the structural, social, and institutional environment. In 1980, wheelchair basketball began at the university or at Edinboro University campus in Erie, Pennsylvania. Displayed below are a couple pictures of the Edinboro University team, as well as their logo, the Fighting Scots. Starting off as a recreational sport, the team was open to student organizations, faculty, and anyone that wanted to try the game. In the late 90s, under the leadership of Jim Glatch, the team transitioned to a competitive model and moved to the athletic department. And to this day is one of 2 programs that actually exists side by side other varsity sports within the athletic department at their institution. In 1985, the University of Arizona started its path in adaptive athletics, and today they are one of the most diverse adaptive athletic programs in the country, serving over 100 athletes in a wide variety of sports that include swimming, golf, basketball, tennis, rugby, hand cycling, track, bocce, sled hockey, and more. 1990 was another landmark year for disability rights with the passing of the Americans with Disabilities Act. The ADA prohibits discrimination and guarantees that people with disabilities have the same opportunities as everyone else to participate in the mainstream of American life. Now, there are two important titles within the ADA. There's a total of 5 that specifically deal with adaptive or specifically deal with sport and are specifically applicable to the realm of collegiate adaptive sport. Title II states that no qualified individual with a disability shall be excluded from participation in or be denied the benefits of services, programs, or activities of a public entity. Title III is very similar, but deals with places of public accommodation. And the combination of these two titles are really all encompassing then in terms of their application to high school athletic associations, K-12 schools, university institutions, and even the NCAA. Because even private entities are not safe from the culpability of the ADA in terms of their obligation to provide equitable opportunities for people with disabilities. Case in point is the PGA Tour and the famous Supreme Court case of Casey Martin v. PGA Tour. Essentially, Casey Martin, as a result of his disability, required the use of a golf cart to be able to participate in PGA Tour events as a golfer. The PGA Tour, being a private entity, at first was denying the case because it was a private entity, not a operator with public funds. But the case was made, and Casey Martin was supported by the Supreme Court because the PGA Tour leases and operates places of public accommodation where these competitions take place. So by nature of operating facilities, leagues that are open to the general public that they are then qualifiable for, they are then obligated to abide by the rules of abide by the law of the ADA. So at the end of the day, Casey Martin was able to participate and play in the PGA Tour by use of a golf cart. And it was fundamentally groundbreaking in terms of the application to sport, because the PGA Tour argued that they are not responsible for making such individualized assessments when it comes to understanding whether somebody is deserving of having an accommodation or not. However, the court countered that there are much more critical entities and people in professions such as doctors and lawyers that need to make these individualized assessments on a daily basis. And arguably, those decisions have much greater burden and societal impact than golf does in daily life. In summary, I think one of the greatest things to take away from this ADA case, and that really laid precedent for a lot of things that we see within academia, within work, and within sport, is the necessity to take individualized assessment into account when executing the ADA. Moving on forward, in 2001, we had the introduction of Collegiate Wheelchair Tennis Nationals, the first and most robust collegiate wheelchair tennis tournament in the United States, and is still running today, which is where our team currently is in Orlando. In 2003 marked the entry of Alabama Adaptive Athletics, a collegiate adaptive sport program that many deem to be a benchmark of what adaptive sport should look like within the collegiate adaptive sport space. The 2010s were a decade of flourishing growth in adaptive sports with the creation of programs at Auburn, MSU, San Diego State, Eastern Washington, just to name a few. Now, the last piece of law that I'll mention is the 2013 Dear Colleague letter. Now, the most important points that came from this Dear Colleague letter from the Office of Civil Rights were the points regarding the inclusion and effective accommodation of people with disabilities when it came to extracurricular opportunities and particularly athletics. Again, going back to the narrative of women in sport, a lot of the details and a lot of the points clarified by the Office of Civil Rights drew direct comparisons to Title III's three-part effective accommodation test, in that public institutions and programs are obligated to provide proportional opportunities for people with disabilities to engage in sport, must show a continuing practice of expanding opportunities in sport for people with disabilities, and that interest and ability must be fully and effectively met of the disabled population. Now, oftentimes, schools, programs, companies, organizations may cite that we're not going to invest in efforts or programs in something that supports people with disabilities, or insert any other minority population here, because there just simply aren't the numbers, and it isn't worth the return on investment. But there's a fallacy in that argument there. And the best point that I can bring up to counteract that is a Supreme Court case when we look at in Title IX history of Cohen v. Brown University, where the Supreme Court, where Brown University tried to make that same point, in that there was no point in investing in and supporting women's sport within their college because there just wasn't interest and ability. And the Supreme Court denied that argument and stated that interest and ability do not develop in a vacuum. They develop and evolve as a function of opportunity and experience. And I think that's incredibly important when we think about the expansion and growth of adaptive sport programs across the country, whether it's the grassroots level, collegiate level, or beyond, is that there needs to be the program, there needs to be the opportunity, there needs to be the mechanism that exists that facilitates participation for interest and ability and participation to be able to grow. So when we look at the University of Michigan narrative, for example, and the investment that we're doing in K-12 programming, in RX to Play or Prescription to Play, which I'll touch upon further, and other community-facing initiatives, they're very intentional and very strategic, in that by creating those opportunities for people to get linked into and connected to our program, we are driving interest and ability such that there is then demand within the community to engage in these sports and activities. And ultimately, all roads then lead to college programming, whether that's University of Michigan or any other university. If we never provide that opportunity for people to participate and compete, how is that interest and ability ever going to develop? Now, what the 2013 Dear Colleague letter resulted in actually was the 2016 ECAC Inclusive Sport Initiative. I'll go through these fairly quickly, just looking at time as well. But the ECAC Inclusive Sport Initiative is very fundamental in terms of current efforts that are existing when it comes to NCAA participation and inclusion of people with disabilities. Essentially, what the principles of sport inclusion state are that there are multiple ways in which we can look at inclusion of people with disabilities that do not fundamentally alter the nature of competition. Again, looking back to what does otherwise qualified mean, and where do people draw that line? Well, by coming up with such principles in these strategies for parasport inclusion, we can then negate the arguments that come our way of inclusion of adaptive athletes is going to fundamentally alter or change sport, or change the NCAA, or change insert any other organization here. So to put this into context, when we look at the principles of sport inclusion, principle 1 states that no changes need to be made to the sport structure or rules because the person's disability or ability, for that matter, is such that no rules or equipment needs to be modified for their participation to take place. When we look at principle 2, there's reasonable accommodations that are made for people with physical disabilities so that they can still participate, but it's not fundamentally altering the nature of the sport. The best way to think about this are college athletes that use prosthetics to compete in sports like track and field, or baseball, or football. There's precedence for this over the last 20, 30 years of athletes doing such things and competing at that level safely and competitively. Principle three is the inclusion or addition of events that allow for equitable participation, but doesn't fundamentally alter the competition. So a good example of this is adding wheelchair track as an event to ambulatory meets. You can easily run additional heats in, the 100 meter or 400 meter. That doesn't change the overall outcome of the meet, but is inclusive of people in that use wheelchair track chairs. Or another example is wheelchair tennis, is the addition of wheelchair tennis alongside able-bodied tennis. And lastly is principle 4, which is the addition of teams or sports where no such integration can happen, but is still needed to fully adapt to and include parallel sports like wheelchair basketball or wheelchair rugby. This then brings us to the creation of University of Michigan Adaptive Sports and Fitness, which I will skip over to just in interest of time. University of Michigan Adaptive Sports and Fitness has really taken this holistic approach that I've talked about before in this presentation, recognizing that when we think about sport, there's a pipeline that needs to exist. And the disability community is very different from the able-bodied community in that you can be born with a disability or you can acquire a disability at any stage in your life. And because of that, the complexity in terms of how people get introduced to adaptive sport need to be well thought out. There need to be initiatives in place such that at any stage in life, people have that on-ramp to then be able to discover and get involved in adaptive sport at a recreational level and at a competitive level. So we have built the adaptive sport program here at University of Michigan in such a way that captures those various touch points that somebody may have across their lifespan, so they have that continued involvement, so that there isn't a leaky pipeline when it comes to building adaptive sport and participation in adaptive sport. To summarize briefly, we have an adaptive sport research consortium. This brings together various researchers from across several adaptive sport programs in the country and other institutions as well that are interested in adaptive sport research. This is a largely under-researched area when you look at the sociology aspect or business aspect of adaptive sport, but also the sports science research, whether it's studying the biomechanics of prosthetics in track and field, or understanding VO2 max and heat regulation in spinal cord injury athletes, like in wheelchair rugby or in hand cycling, or understanding the biomechanic impacts of wheelchair design in sport to optimize performance. We also have the Adaptive Sport and Inclusive Recreation Initiative, or ASIRI for short, where we are actively embedding adaptive sport as part of the physical education curriculum in K-12 schools in Ann Arbor, with the long-term objective of making that a statewide initiative. When we look at the physical education guidelines at the state level, it only talks about getting from point A to point B, or throwing an object with accuracy, or achieving an objective with a team. When we look at those principles or foundations within physical education, we can achieve all of those objectives by playing sports like wheelchair basketball or sitting volleyball or goalball. And it's a way that we can then include people with disabilities and integrate people with disabilities in physical education in such a way that changes the perceptions and dynamics socially across teachers and students with and without disabilities. We have our adaptive student athlete program, where we have working groups and committees and are involved in efforts in expanding inclusion of adaptive sport within the NCAA. We have prescription to play, which I talked about earlier, again, recognizing that people can acquire a disability at any point in their life. And a primary point of access that people could have to sport is by way of physicians and doctors and sport medicine professionals and physical therapists. If we can get them, get these healthcare professionals to refer people out to recreational programs in our area, like our program or UMAIS or the Great Lakes Adaptive Sports Association, that can be a very effective mechanism of quite literally prescribing play to a population that needs it. Then we have our adaptive fitness and adaptive sport programming that provides recreational and competitive opportunities for people across all the sports shown on the screen. But more importantly, what these sports and programs offer is a social opportunity, bringing people together. And more importantly, bring people together that have shared life experiences or can learn from other life experiences. Adaptive sport is an incredible way that we can create a unifying language for people within the disability community so we can learn from each other, we can grow as professionals, as people, as humans, as friends, as athletes. And it really takes a combination of all these different efforts and investments to create a holistic environment such that whether you are a professor, a researcher, a physician, an athlete, a parent, a student, someone with a disability, without a disability, there needs to be all these different touch points in place, all these different branches, so that everyone has that opportunity to access sport and converse through sport. Thank you for tuning in today for this presentation. That largely concludes the main message that I would like to deliver is that through all of our collective efforts, we have the opportunity and we have the responsibility to support the growth of adaptive sports. Happy to take any questions that people may have from the audience and expand on anything that I touched on today.
Thank you so much, Erik. I really appreciate your presentation. You've covered a lot of ground and given certainly a lot of areas for us to consider as primary care, family medicine, internal medicine, pediatrics. How can we best move this forward to not only get more individuals included? I know you talked about several programs like prescription to play. So talking to a primary care audience, what are several key strategies? Where should they get the resources? How they can make those connections? Many of us are not going to be familiar with these resources. So what would be the best way to disseminate, get these resources out, and hopefully be an advocate for change?
Yeah, thank you for that question. There are a few things that come to mind. So through prescription to play specifically, we've hosted engagement events for professional staff, for physicians, and for students to firsthand engage in adaptive sports. One of the best ways to really understand what it is and how it works is by getting in the chair, so to speak, and playing yourself. So we've hosted wheelchair basketball demos and clinics for healthcare providers, for professionals, for staff. And that's something that we're open to doing in the future and happy to have further conversations with people that are interested in doing that. We've also gone in person to various clinics within the Southeast Michigan area, like Walk the Line Rehab Clinic, to do equipment demonstrations for staff and for patients real time during their sessions to get them exposed to the various adaptive sport equipment that exists. Sometimes it is quite a barrier in kind of a, I would say, personal barrier for some in terms of getting into adaptive sport because of the foreign nature or the unfamiliarity with equipment. So we found that through equipment introductions, we can help people get comfortable with equipment, using it, transferring into it, transferring out of the equipment, so that it is something that is more tangible in terms of how they think about adaptive sport and the opportunities that exist. We've also engaged with organizations and other institutions like Penn State Health in doing demos and events like their annual Rec Fest that they host at Penn State that brings together vendors and organizations that are not only within the adaptive sport realm, but various other organizations and healthcare companies and services that provide support for people with disabilities in the community in kind of a one-stop shop convention center where people with disabilities kind of in that Penn State area flock to then get information about all the different resources that exist, not just from recreation or education, but vocation, housing, other social services. So these kinds of events are really good, but are also only kind of one-off circumstances that people can then only one-off interactions. When we look at something that's more sustainable or long-term, one important thing is for practitioners to know what adaptive sports exist. Is when we think about somebody's disability, there or kind of eligibility for adaptive sport. If we know someone's someone you're seeing a patient with a spinal cord injury or that is an amputee, it is helpful to know what sports or activities they would be eligible for, what things that they could participate in, and what programs exist in their area. A great resource right now for that is Move United, and being familiar with that resource and giving people that link or getting them connected with Move United is a great step in making that prescription per se and directing people to a database or a network of organizations that exist across the country. Move United also provides a lot of educational material and resources for practitioners and physicians and for participants and parents. So that's a great resource. And then lastly, Adaptive Sports and Fitness is in the process of launching an equipment loan program that will operate out of the Disability Network here in Ann Arbor. And through this equipment loan program, people will be able to take out hand cycles, sport chairs, and other adaptive sport equipment to be able to try on their own time and leisure as a way to then be active, knowing that the cost of equipment can sometimes be a barrier for people.
Wonderful, thank you. So we have a question from the audience. Have you partnered with secondary education, PEDS primary care in Michigan to increase adaptive sports visibility for younger kids? Curious to see how this would increase awareness and importance at the collegiate level.
Yeah, certainly. I hope I'm interpreting this question correctly. But one of the main initiatives that we have going on that's community facing is the Adaptive Sport and Inclusive Recreation Initiative, where we are working with PE teachers to do a train the trainer type model to teach them about disability, disability inclusion, disability culture, but then also train them on how to teach adaptive sports within the PE setting. We then provide them with lesson plans, curricula, equipment, so that they can then teach a 6-week curriculum that includes wheelchair basketball, wheelchair tennis, sitting volleyball, and goalball to all of their students in general PE. And through this initiative, what we're working towards is creating state guidelines for how to include adaptive PE within the physical education curriculum across the entire state. So we've expanded this now from Ann Arbor to Ypsilanti, and we're working with other organizations to potentially expand that up to the Flint area. And then we've actually had interest in this initiative across other areas of the country, where University of Arizona has actually adopted what we've created within A-Series and have launched it within the Tucson area quite successfully as well. So I hope that answers the question. And the long-term hope is that with the growth of and participation in adaptive PE within the general PE setting, there are a lot more kids with disabilities that are getting off the sidelines and meaningfully and intentionally included within the physical education setting. But it also builds greater awareness and knowledge among all students with or without disabilities, so that when they progress and graduate and go on to college, they're already very familiar and in tune with the opportunities that exist because of their experiences within the K-12 system.
Thank you so much, Eric. So we are at the end of the hour, and if possible, we would like to have some of the available resources, if we could put it on MDisability website link so people can actually access it and hopefully disseminate it further. So thank you again so much. And also thank you for our captionist, Pam, and thank you, Dawn and Liz, for helping to coordinate this event. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.